The wind arrives before anything else. Not the kind of wind you pull a jacket against. Not the kind that rattles windows or bends trees. There are no trees here. There is nothing here to bend. This wind comes off the Siberian plateau like a living thing that has decided, with complete indifference, to strip the heat from your body one layer at a time. It finds the gap at your collar. It finds the space between your glove and your sleeve. It finds you. And at minus 50 degrees Celsius, nearly 100 degrees below freezing, exposed skin doesn't ache. It doesn't burn. It simply begins to die, quietly, within minutes. This is the Mongolian steppe in winter. A treeless plain larger than Western Europe, offering no shelter, no walls, no mercy. A landscape so hostile that modern survival experts will tell you flatly, without proper equipment and training, you would not last the night. And yet, for over 1,000 years, families didn't just survive here. They raised children here. They built cultures here. They launched the largest land empire in human history from this frozen ground. How? That question has a specific answer. And that answer involves wind, felt, fire, animals, and a way of thinking about nature that modern civilization has almost entirely forgotten. What the Mongols understood about cold, about shelter, about warmth, about the relationship between human beings and the world that's trying to kill them, is what this is about. Stay with it, because by the end, you won't just understand how they survived. You'll understand something about survival itself. By October, something shifts in a Mongol herder's body. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. A sharpening. A kind of full-body attention that has no name in modern language, because modern life has no equivalent for it. We have no word for the state of a person whose every decision, from this moment forward, will determine whether their family is alive in spring. We call them nomads, as if movement were the point. But movement was never the point. Survival was the point. And survival began with a single question that had to be answered correctly, every single year, with no margin for error. Where do we sleep tonight? The steppe looks uniform to an untrained eye. Endless rolling grassland, identical in every direction, stretching past every horizon. But to eyes trained across generations, the steppe told a completely different story. It revealed shallow depressions where wind would pass overhead instead of through. It revealed rock outcroppings that could break a gust before it reached the camp. Most critically, it revealed the southern faces of hills and ridgelines, places where the low winter sun could deliver a few degrees of warmth that, in the mathematics of extreme cold, meant the difference between snow that melted slightly and exposed grass for grazing, and snow that stayed frozen and starved the herd. The Mongols called this reading of the land Nair, the art of finding the shadow of the mountain. And it was exactly that, an art, passed down not in writing, not in maps, but in memory, in language, in the quiet instruction of a father pointing to a hillside and saying, "Here, this is where we go when the cold comes." Water was the second requirement, and it was non-negotiable. Even locked under ice, a nearby stream or river was the only reliable source for both animals and humans through the deep winter months. The camp had to be close enough to reach it daily, close enough that children could make the walk to chop through the surface and reach the flowing water beneath, even on the coldest mornings. But here is what the history books rarely say about all of this. These winter camp locations were not discovered fresh each year. They were inherited. The same valleys, the same protected hillsides, the same frozen streams, used repeatedly, across decades, sometimes across centuries, by families who understood that the knowledge of safe ground was worth more than any physical possession they could carry. A Mongol father did not leave his children silver. He did not leave them land in any permanent sense. The most valuable thing he left them was the memory of a valley, the specific knowledge of where the wind could not reach them, where the sun would find them, where the water ran beneath the ice. That memory was their fortune. That memory was the first wall of their winter fortress, built long before a single piece of felt was ever unrolled. Here is something that sounds simple until you think about it carefully. A single yurt, standing alone on the winter steppe, is not a home. It is a coffin waiting to be sealed. One structure against that wind, against that cold, against a storm system that can drop temperatures 20 degrees in an hour. It would not hold. The genius of Mongol winter survival was never in the individual shelter. It was in what happened when those shelters came together. It was in the arrangement. The winter camp formation had a name, the kure, meaning circle, and the word circle undersells it completely. This was not families parking their homes in a rough loop for convenience or community. This was a defensive system, engineered across centuries of Arctic survival, refined through generations of families who learned what worked by watching what failed. Each ger was positioned with its door facing south or southeast, away from the prevailing Siberian winds, toward whatever warmth the low winter sun could offer. The gaps between structures were minimized, until the outer ring of yurts formed something close to a continuous wall of felt and wood at ground level, exactly where wind carries its most lethal chill. And at the center of this circle, something remarkable happened. The blocked wind, the residual heat from multiple fires, the breath and body warmth of dozens of human beings, it all pooled. The interior of the kure became a thermal trap, several degrees warmer than the open steppe just meters away. Into that protected core, every evening as temperatures dropped toward their nightly lows, the herders drove their most vulnerable animals, sheep, goats, young cattle, clustered together in the wind-blocked center, their collective body heat raising the ambient temperature by 5 to 10 degrees. The animals protected by the humans warmed by the animals. A system so integrated, so mutually dependent, that separating its parts would have killed them both. But the kure was only the outer wall. What happened inside the felt? That is where the real engineering begins. Step through the door of a winter ger, and you are stepping into one of the most thermally sophisticated small structures ever built by human hands. The shape alone is not accidental. That circular base, that gently domed roof, wind encounters it and has nowhere to push. No flat wall to batter, no sharp edge to grab. The air simply flows around it, following the curve, carrying its force past and away. It is aerodynamics solved not in a laboratory, but on a killing plane, across 1,000 years of people noticing what stood and what collapsed. Beneath that aerodynamic shell, the real defense, up to 12 layers of thick felt wrapped around the frame. Felt is one of the most effective insulators ever developed by any civilization anywhere on Earth, and the Mongols had been perfecting its production for centuries. It is not woven. It is compressed. Matted wool fibers locked together so densely that the material creates millions of microscopic air pockets, each one a tiny barrier against heat transfer. Modern synthetic insulation manufacturers have spent decades trying to replicate what Mongol women were producing by hand. Some thermal properties of traditional felt have still not been matched. The outermost layer was treated with animal fat or rendered oil, waterproofed against snow and ice, preventing moisture from reaching the insulating layers beneath. And beneath everything, the floor received equal attention, because the frozen ground beneath a shelter can drain body heat as effectively as wind. The earth was covered with layers of old felt, then animal hides placed fur side up, then dried grass, each layer adding another barrier between human warmth and the cold that wanted to reclaim it. At the center of everything stood the iron stove, the zug, positioned directly beneath the crown opening in the roof, the tunuk. This was not simply a fire. This was a convection engine. Heat rose through the roof vent, while the pressure it created drew fresh cold air in through carefully controlled gaps at floor level. The entire interior breathed, continuously, moving warm air through the space and pulling dangerous carbon monoxide out through the top. Other cultures across history have killed entire families in sealed winter shelters, dying warm, as the phrase goes, poisoned by the fire they depended on. The Mongols solved that problem with geometry and airflow, built into the structure itself. And then there is the detail that stops most people when they first hear it. The geometric patterns decorating the felt walls, the intricate designs that look purely ornamental, that museum photographs present as examples of Mongol artistic tradition, were not decorative, they were structural. The patterns reinforced the stress points, where wind pressure concentrated across the felt surface, distributing force away from any single location to prevent tears or gaps where heat could escape. The beauty was load-bearing, the art was engineering, and in the darkest blizzards, when visibility dropped to nothing, and a family member needed to find their own shelter in a whiteout. The specific colors and patterns of each family's jur served as identification, a visual signature readable even through snow. Beauty and survival, in the Mongol winter, were not two different things. They were the same thing, expressed in wool. The result of all of this, the curry arrangement, the aerodynamic shape, the 12 layers, the convection stove, the insulated floor, was a living space that could maintain temperatures 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the outside air. When the steppe reached -50 degrees Celsius, the interior of a well-managed jur could hold above -10. Cold by any modern standard of comfort, but warm enough for human bodies to function, to eat, to speak, to sleep, to wake up. 40 degrees of difference, built from wool, wood, and the accumulated knowledge of people who could not afford to get it wrong. There is a moment in every Mongolian winter night that the herders understood and respected in a way that has no modern parallel. It is not the moment the sun goes down. It is not the moment the first stars appear. It is somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the fire has burned lowest, when the felt walls have given back all the warmth they absorbed during the day, when the human bodies inside have been still long enough that their collective heat has begun to thin. This is when the steppe collected its debts. This is the most dangerous hour. Not the blizzard, not the storm, not the dramatic visible violence of extreme weather, but this quiet, invisible, patient cold that crept in at the edges while everyone slept. The Mongols knew this, and everything about the way they slept was designed around surviving it. Privacy, first of all, was simply not available. Not as a concept, not as a practice, not as something anyone would have thought to want. Parents, children, grandparents, visiting relatives, occasional guests. Everyone slept together in the close interior of the jur, arranged not by preference or comfort, but by thermal logic. Children went in the middle, surrounded on all sides by adult bodies generating heat. The elderly, whose bodies produced less warmth of their own, were positioned closest to the fire, where the accumulated heat was greatest. Every sleeping position was a calculation. Every arrangement of bodies in that small round space was a decision about who needed warmth most and how to distribute what was available. We sleep alone in climate-controlled rooms and call it civilized living. The Mongols slept pressed together against the cold and called it survival. The question worth sitting with is which of those two arrangements understood warmth more deeply. No one undressed for sleep. The heavy deal robes worn through the day stayed on through the night, adding their insulation to the body even while lying still. The heaviest outer coats were not hung up or folded away. Removing them from the equation of warmth would have been a kind of recklessness. Instead, they became additional blankets, layered over sleeping bodies, their weight pressing down and trapping the warm air close to the skin. Beneath the bodies, sleeping platforms called sherdaks raised everyone off the ground. That same frozen ground that, without barriers, would have pulled heat out of a sleeping person as efficiently as open wind. Above the sherdaks came layers of old felt, then animal hides laid fur side up, then the heavy sheepskin and wolf pelt blankets that formed the final layer between a sleeping human body and the cold that surrounded it on every side. Multiple layers, always multiple layers, each one adding a margin, and in the mathematics of -50 degrees, every margin was the difference between waking up and not. But the most extraordinary element of the Mongol night, the detail that modern researchers keep returning to, the thing that sits at the exact intersection of practicality and something that feels almost like tenderness, was the animals. On the coldest nights, when exterior temperatures dropped to -40 or below, and the thermal arithmetic inside the jur became tight, newborn lambs were brought inside, goat kids, young calves, small animals, carried in from the wind and placed near the door in a designated area, close enough to contribute their body heat to the interior air, positioned carefully enough not to disturb the sleeping family. A few young animals can raise the temperature inside a small space by several degrees. Several degrees, at -40, is not a small thing. Several degrees is survival. And so a Mongol family in the depths of winter slept surrounded by each other, by layers of wool and hide, by the slow breathing of newborn animals keeping them warm, all of them together in a circle of shared heat. waiting for a dawn that would come eventually, that always came eventually, if you had built your systems correctly and maintained them through the night. Someone always kept the fire. This is the detail that stays with you. Through the coldest months, the fire in the Zug was never allowed to go out during the night hours. Family members took shifts, waking in the dark to add fuel. Dried argol, compressed animal dung that burned hot and clean, to keep the flame alive until morning. This was not a chore assigned to the least important person in the household. In many families, it was the role of the most trusted, the most reliable, the one whose judgment and dedication was beyond question. Because the fire was not a comfort, the fire was everyone. The one who kept the fire kept the family alive. And there is something in that, in the image of a single person sitting awake in the deep Mongolian winter dark, feeding a flame while everyone they loved slept around them. That goes beyond survival technique. It is the oldest form of care that exists. Staying awake so that others can rest. Holding the warmth so that others do not have to feel the cold. This system of sleeping together, breathing together, tending the fire together, it taught the Mongols something about human interdependence that we have spent centuries of modern progress trying to convince ourselves we no longer need. So here is the question this entire story has been building toward. What did they know that we don't? Not the techniques. The techniques are documented now, studied by Arctic researchers, and military cold weather engineers, and survival specialists, who have spent careers reverse engineering what Mongol herders figured out across generations of living and dying on the steppe. The techniques can be learned. What is harder to learn, what cannot be written down in a manual, or replicated in a laboratory, is the thinking behind the techniques. The Mongols did not ask, how do we defeat winter? They never approached the steppe as an enemy to be conquered, a force to be overpowered, a problem requiring a solution that would make the cold irrelevant. They asked something quieter and more difficult. What does winter require of us? What does this landscape demand? And how do we become the kind of people who can meet that demand completely? That shift, from domination to adaptation, from conquest to integration, is the thing that 12 layers of felt and a circular camp formation and newborn lambs sleeping beside a family cannot fully explain on their own. It is the mindset inside the system that made the system work. Once every decade or so, the Zud arrived. This was not a harsh winter. This was a catastrophic one. The kind that tested every element of the survival system simultaneously and without mercy. Summer drought, followed by early freeze. Snowfall, so deep it buried entire pastures, cutting herds off from grazing for weeks at a time. Temperatures that broke even the Mongols' considerable understanding of cold. The Zud did not announce itself. It simply arrived, and then it stayed, and everything the family had built, the kure, the gur, the fire protocols, the knowledge of water sources under ice, faced its ultimate examination. Archaeological evidence from winter campsites across Mongolia tells us that the overall survival rate through these extreme events was, by any reasonable measure, remarkable. Not because the system was perfect, not because every family made it through every Zud, but because a way of living so deeply integrated with its environment, so thoroughly adapted to the worst conditions that environment could produce, failed far less often than it had any right to. They had become part of the cold, and the cold, in return, could not fully claim them. That same adaptive thinking, the mobility, the flexibility, the refusal to build anything that could not be dismantled and reassembled in a matter of hours, shaped more than winter survival. It shaped war. The Mongol military operated on the same principles as the Mongol winter camp. Move faster than the enemy expects. Adapt to terrain rather than fighting it. Carry everything you need and need only what you can carry. The Yurt did not just shelter families through the winter. It taught an entire civilization how to think. And that civilization, thinking that way, built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The Winter Fortress and the World Empire were not separate achievements. They were the same achievement, expressed at different scales. When spring finally returned to the steppe, and it always did return, even after the worst Zud, even after the winters that seemed to have no end, the felt walls came down. The kure dissolved. The livestock spread out onto the greening grass. Within hours, sometimes within a single morning, the winter camp that had been a fortress, a thermal system, a collective act of survival, simply ceased to exist. No permanent structure left behind. No mark on the landscape that would tell a passing stranger anything had ever been there. Only the families themselves, alive, moving forward, carrying in their minds the complete knowledge of how to do it all again when October came. That knowledge, not the felt, not the iron stove, not the specific valley where the wind couldn't reach them. That knowledge was the real shelter. It always had been. In a world increasingly defined by extreme weather, by climate anxiety, by the growing and uncomfortable sense that the environment we built our civilization around is shifting beneath our feet, there is a temptation to respond the way we always respond. With more technology, higher walls, stronger systems, better insulation. And those things matter, but the Mongols offer a different model. Not the heated building that fights the cold from the outside. The adaptive mind that flows with it from the inside. Not the structure that makes the environment irrelevant. The understanding that makes the environment a partner, rather than an adversary. They did not survive the Mongolian winter by refusing to be cold. They survived it by understanding cold so completely, so intimately, at such depth, that they could find the warmth hidden inside it. In the curve of a hillside, in the breath of a lamb, in the fire tended by someone who loved them enough to stay awake. The wind still comes first. It always has. It will again tonight. Somewhere on that treeless plain, at -50 degrees, indifferent and patient and absolute. The question is not whether it's coming. The question is what you've built. Inside yourself, inside your community, inside your understanding of the world you actually live in, before it arrives.